What's up, everybody? Matt Gajeski here, back again with the Awesemo Fantasy Football YouTube channel. And today we're going to talk the top 5 Dynasty rookie quarterbacks. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you today by Underdog Fantasy. And if you've never heard of Underdog, they have all sorts of contests available to you guys. They have basketball drafts, live drafts, pick 'em contests, and you can make up to 20 extra entry fee. Also, if you use the promo code Awesemo, you can get a match deposit bonus up to $100. So make sure to check out Underdog Fantasy today. Diving right into this, we have our top 5 Dynasty quarterbacks. I think we can kind of guess the order, at least number 1, and that's going to be Kenny Pickett. What it comes down to, Kenny Pickett was really the only quarterback drafted in this class with any sort of capital. A lot of people were expecting multiple first-round picks, but that just didn't come true. Kenny Pickett was the first one off the board to the Pittsburgh Steelers. He has good size. He has decent athleticism. He actually ran a 4.73 40-yard dash, and he stands 6'3", 217 pounds. The production for Pickett is also solid, especially this most recent year where he really broke out, completed 67% of his passes for 4,319 yards, 8.7 yards per attempt, and he has solid advanced metrics too. Didn't have the best average depth of target, but he did have a pretty decent pressure to sack rate. He did not commit a lot of turnover-worthy plays. The one knock against him is he did take a long time to throw, and he is a bit of a one-year wonder at Pittsburgh. He is a 3-year starter, but those first 2 years weren't the best for Pickett. The offensive line was a problem during that time, and we saw that manifest itself even this year when the offensive line was better. There were times where Kenny Pickett would be looking downfield, feel the imaginary pressure, look around him as if it were there, realize that it wasn't, and then try to go back downfield again. So those are kind of some of the scars from early offensive line issues. In Pittsburgh, he's going to be competing with Mitch Trubisky right away. There's a chance he comes out there and starts day one. Unlike the other quarterbacks in this class, Pickett's first-round draft capital is going to give him multiple chances to start in probably multiple years with a pretty decent offense. We have some skill position players in Najee Harris, Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool. They spent another pick on George Pickens. It's a pretty decent spot. For a player comparison perspective, he looks like Derek Carr, Ryan Tannehill, Kirk Cousins, players of that mold. So the question is, can he ascend and become the higher end starter of that group? Or is he just your middling option like maybe a Ryan Tannehill? But he still is number 1 dynasty QB, and it comes from the draft capital. Outside of Pickett, we had 3 quarterbacks come off the board in the 3rd round. Not much separating them in terms of draft capital, but we can look at skill set and find some differences for dynasty. First one we're going to stick with is Malik Willis. A lot of people thought he was in play at pick number 2 to the Detroit Lions. Laughably falls all the way to the 3rd round, but he's the signal caller coming out of Liberty. Good size, 6'1", 219. Did not test, but this is one of the most athletic prospects we've seen at the quarterback position, really since a Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, maybe Kyler Murray. When we look at his rushing ability in 2020 and 2021, he had at least 878 yards in both seasons and 13 yards just on the ground. As a quarterback, passing the ball leaves a little bit to be desired. He did not dominate competition at Liberty. He never threw for more than 3,000 yards in a season, 8.5 yards per attempt maxed out there. And he never completed above 65% of his passes. And again, that's against some very questionable competition. The best team he faced this year was Ole Miss. He completed 64% of his passes for 173 yards and 3 interceptions in that game. And once you get beyond Ole Miss, the only other Power 5 opponent this team faced was Syracuse. So it's a really easy schedule, and it's concerning that he did not dominate competition. However, for dynasty and fantasy, this is a guy with elite rushing ability. Ryan Tannehill is ahead of him, and Ryan Tannehill likely starts most, if not all, of this year. But the Titans can save a significant amount of money moving on from him next year. Now, that doesn't mean Malik Willis is the QB of the future for the Titans, but if he ever does step on the field, he immediately would become an elite rushing quarterback. So for that reason, he's still ahead of some of the other players in this category just because the spiked weak potential he gives you as a dual threat is immense. Going to QB3, probably QB2 for some people, we have Desmond Ridder coming out of Cincinnati. He's drafted to Atlanta in the 3rd round, 6'3", 211. Another athletic prospect, not in the same range as a Malik Willis, but a 4.52. Certainly serviceable athleticism here. He's just shy of 23 years old, 4-year starter at Cincinnati. Really took a step forward this year, completed 65% of his passes for 3,334 yards, 8.6 yards per attempt, 30 to 8 touchdown to interception ratio. And he's athletic on the ground too. He had 3 of his 4 seasons above 500 rushing yards. He's had 18 rushing touchdowns over the last 2 years by themselves. And he runs an offense that's a little more conducive to pro success. Unlike a Malik Willis or maybe even a Kenny Pickett, the offense that Luke Fickell and Mike Denbrock ran at Cincinnati was more zone read based, doing more NFL level stuff. So he is viewed as a player that can come in and at least participate right away. He does have his concerns. He also did not necessarily dominate competition at Cincinnati. We look at that schedule. When they did face tough opponents, it wasn't always smooth sailing for Ridder. Against Alabama, completed 53% of his passes, 144 yards. A couple other notable teams on here. 210 yards against Indiana. Did have 297 against Notre Dame. So some ups and downs against better competition. But overall, from a player perspective, he looks a little bit like a cross between Kellen Mond and Lamar Jackson. There's very rare athleticism here. You just don't see athletes coming out of college football that have potential to start in the NFL like this. For the Atlanta Falcons, they have Marcus Mariota on their roster as kind of this stopgap between Ridder and Mariota, and maybe even a quarterback of the future if they were to address it again. There's a very real chance Ridder plays this year. How many games or at what capacity leaves a lot to be desired. I mean, Atlanta has one of the worst offensive skill position groups in the NFL. They do draft Drake London and have Kyle Pitts, but still, we're talking about a team that has a lot of work to do. So if Ridder gets out there, he'll likely be in that 20 to 12 range for starting quarterbacks, and we just don't know how many games he's going to give us with the third-round capital. The next third-round quarterback and the fourth of this group is going to be Matt Corral. He goes off the board to Carolina. I think it's kind of a steal on their part. They were rumored to be considering quarterback in the top 6, but they get Corral in the third. He's 6'2", 212, 23 years old. Didn't test because he got injured in the bowl game, but he was the starting QB for Ole Miss and had a phenomenal year this past year. Completed just shy of 70% of his passes. He's been over 3,300 yards in the last 2 years, over 9 yards per attempt, 20 to 5 touchdown to interception ratio. He's a player that doesn't take a lot of sacks. He's very mobile, even though we don't have the athletic testing time. We know this. Only a 15.4 pressure to sack conversion rate. He's a player that makes a lot of good decisions with the ball, just 2% turnover worthy plays. That was the best in this class. He was running that Lane Kiffin, Jeff Lebby RPO-based shotgun spread scheme, so it does give him some favorable chances to give receivers yards after catch ability. But this guy that's playing in the SEC, this is not Liberty. This is not Cincinnati. He's facing the best competition week in, week out, putting up these numbers. Now, Matt Corral, from a rushing perspective, also gives you a bit on the ground. He's had over 500 rushing yards in each of the last 2 years, 15 combined touchdowns. So that's solid for Corral. And unlike the other quarterbacks above, Carolina very clearly is trying to find a replacement for Darnold this year. They were in on Deshaun Watson, didn't get there. So I think Sam Darnold as your starting QB could be out of the lineup as soon as week 4. Whereas it appears teams like Atlanta are comfortable with their stopgap Mariota. The Titans certainly are with Ryan Tannehill. So this is spot where Corral might be starting ahead of those guys. And he actually has a pretty decent skill position group around him with McCaffrey, DJ Moore, Robbie Anderson. They spent a high pick on Terrace Marshall last year. So Matt Corral as a third-round pick also a little bit intriguing to me. But overall, still a little less mobile than the other two, so they get the edge for dynasty and fantasy. Last player here in the top 5 is Sam Howell. I think a lot of people thought he would get day 2 capital, but he ends up being a 5th-round pick. Washington basically steals him, one of the better picks in this draft. He's very young, only 3-year player at North Carolina, just above 21 years old, 6'1", 218. Solid dual threat, too. I mean, this guy rushed for 828 yards last year, but his best 2 passing seasons came a little earlier in his career. In 2020, he threw for 3,586 yards, 10.3 yards per attempt, 30 touchdowns, only 7 interceptions, completed 68% of his passes. That was, of course, with Diami Brown and Daz Newsome. This past year, those players are gone, so he's moving forward with just Josh Downs, no Javonte Williams, no Michael Carter, and the numbers suffered. Only 8.8 yards per attempt, completed 63% of his passes, but the rushing went way up for him this year. Because the scheme hurt him a little bit, RPO-based spread scheme again, Sam Howell comes off the board this late. But when we look at his fit in Washington, they seem to believe Carson Wentz is the answer. They traded a lot to bring him over, but drafting Howell at least suggests there's some concern. They received a lot of backlash for the Carson Wentz signing. And when you look at Sam Howell, he does profile like a few players they've had before. He's mobile, but he doesn't have that Lamar Jackson style athleticism. They've used Taylor Heineke a bit. Sam Howell's not too different. He's just a bit bigger. When you look at the player comparisons, he does look a lot like a Baker Mayfield. And take that for what it's worth. This is a 5th-round draft pick. Maybe Baker Mayfield should have been drafted a little later. But some other names that popped up, Sam Ehlinger, Easton Stick, players that have mobility, just not that elite range, but then some solid passing with it. So the top 5 dynasty quarterbacks, just to recap, we had number 1, Kenny Pickett, number 2, Malik Willis, number 3, Desmond Ridder, number 4, Matt Corral, number 5, Sam Howell. Let me know what order you view these prospects. My name is Matt Gajeski on Twitter, @Matt_Gajeski. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you again next time.